so much for showing up at noon on a hot day. I hope we can all enjoy the shade. And the very first speaker of today, who is Sean McAllister, and he's here to tell us about psychedelic spirituality and the future of psychedelic churches. And that's all I got. So he's going to have to tell you more about what that means.
All right. Well, I guess I'm using a mic, even though there's just a few of us here, but they want to record this. So thank you all so much for coming. I want to start out just grounding a little bit. I say a lot of words and talk about a lot of legal concepts and what's happening, but as everyone filters in here, just want to invite you to ground down in this moment. Say a lot of things in honor of the indigenous people of this land, the Paiute people, all the Americas, calling in a lot of respect and love for the plant medicine keepers of the world that have kept these traditions alive and are part of the spiritual journey we're going to talk about today. And obviously, one of the deepest wisdoms is just the wisdom of the breath. You know, we're all different in so many ways, and yet one thing we share so deeply is the breath. That we can go 40 days without food, 4 days without water, but you can't go 4 minutes without breath. So just invite you to take a few breaths to start here and center yourself and call in the wisdom of the plant medicines that we'll be talking about today. Call in the ancestors, the spirit of the people of this land, the people of this community, from Burning Man. The spirit of the Amazon, which will be with us so strong today, the union of North and South America, of indigenous and Western, of masculine and feminine, of a Western way of seeing things and a non-Western way of seeing things. We call that energy in today. Just give so much gratitude. So how about 3 quiet breaths to yourself? As we just get going, I just want to acknowledge the amazing karma we all share to be here in this time together. Think about the miracle of our moment right now, 4.5 billion years in this cycle of Earth time that this planet's been here in the solar system, and 14 billion years since the Big Bang, and the fact that our souls were reborn at the same time, and we're here in this time of extremes, time of immense hope and also immense challenge. It really is a miracle. It's as if we all won the lottery 100 times in a row every day for 100 days. It still would be less likely than our joining together today and sharing energy. So I just want to acknowledge that. We have shared karma. We are in this time of rebirth and life together. And we also are just so fortunate because we live in a time where things are changing. And we're coming out of 70 years of very unfortunate ignorance in the West with the drug war. If you think about all of human history, psychedelics and drugs have only been illegal for the last 70 years. For all of human history, it's been a fundamental part of human existence to ingest plant medicines and have a relationship with the natural world. And it was only this unfortunate history of union of the West and the Americas that still persists today. And so I'm a lawyer, and before I get into the formal, who I am and why I'm here, I think it's important to start with the non-Western acknowledgement that I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a musician, I'm a poet, I'm a husband, and there's a lot of things about us other than what we do, but I've had the real benefit and joy of spending 25 years working on drug policy reform back to the mid-90s, and and started working on prison moratorium coalitions in Colorado, where I live. Developed in the mid-90s my first sacred relationships with plant medicines, growing cannabis and mushrooms as well. And just one of the people, part of this wave, this intergenerational transformation that we're part of, from the ignorance of the 50s, 60s, and 70s to a time when our message is winning. Our message of reform and the failures of the drug policies that we have. You are on the right side of this topic. The morals are on our side with reform for drug policy. People should be left alone to choose their own state of consciousness. The economics are on our side with the waste of dollars to drug enforcement. The spirituality is on our side, and that's what we're primarily going to be talking about today. And because the science is now on our side, validating what indigenous people have known for thousands of years, that these medicines have deep value and transformational potential. And people are awakening to this. And so this is the part of this intergenerational wave that we were participating in. When I started working on drug policy reform in Colorado in the late 90s, if you grew one marijuana plant, it was the same level felony as raping your own child. And so now we have 40 states with legal cannabis, and we're winning on psychedelic law reform. And so we've come so far, and I think we can be negative and pessimistic and look at the possible system we're working within and not have hope. But if you just look at it from a longer lens, we're still at the beginning of what psychedelic law reform and churches and spirituality means. We do have a culture in the West around psychedelics. It's been largely built on festivals and music and recreational, hedonistic use of psychedelics, but what's also so encouraging is this rise of the spiritual psychedelic movement. It's always been there. I'm not saying anybody invented it recently. Again, going back to indigenous people, it's been here a long time, but when we talk about the future of psychedelic churches, so I guess the chronology of why I'm here, the Western introduction, is that 25 years of drug policy reform. I helped write a cannabis legalization initiative in Colorado. I founded the nonprofit that ran all the campaigns that legalized cannabis in Colorado, and then turned my attention to psychedelics 6 or 7 years ago. So as we all know, Denver was the first city in the country to decriminalize psilocybin. I was the legal advisor for that campaign, and then wrote Prop 122 with others in Colorado to decriminalize 4 psychedelics in Colorado and create a regulated pathway for psilocybin therapy initially, but we also have DMT, iboga, and mescaline, other than peyote, coming online in the real near future. We can talk a little bit more about the decriminalized areas and what regulation is going to mean, but it's just symbolic of the rise of the consciousness around this issue, the reform that's happening. Oregon has another regulated program. Several states have done smaller psychedelic law reform. But in addition to that policy work I do, I've really started my journey for personal reasons with trauma in my family and around a divorce, my children. And so I've had a spiritual life for 25 years, a regular meditator in the Buddhist tradition, and it's really deeply important to me. I go to God every single day. I'm in devotion every day. And then, part of the wisdom that comes out of that is when I first started using plant medicine ceremonially, you have to give back. This is the first message after my first ayahuasca journey 7 years ago. Okay, how do we make this available for others? And so you're called to service from these medicines. And so I came back and called Rick Doblin, my friend who I've known for 25 years, and said, how do I help ayahuasca? And he put me in touch with the Chacruta Institute, and that's partly who I'm here representing today. I'm on the board of directors of the Chacruta Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines. This is a nonprofit founded by Bila Bache, a Brazilian anthropologist who spent 20 years doing work with ayahuasca, doing anthropological studies, writing 20 books, but Chacruna is a wonderful cutting-edge organization that focuses on spiritual use of psychedelics, on ayahuasca, on BIPOC issues in the movement, on indigenous issues. You want to jump in? Yeah.
I'm just going to ask, can you spell that?
Yeah, chacruna is the leaf that allows the body to take up, chacruna is the leaf that contains the DMT in ayahuasca, and so it is CHACRUNA, chacruna. And there are other names for that plant and other plants that are used. We just had a Yahe experience recently. But yes, chacruna is one of the main ingredients of ayahuasca. So chacruna.net, and they have a conference every year in the spring, and it's usually heavily focused on the religious and spiritual work along with those other topics I mentioned. So definitely want to encourage people to check out chacruna.net. There's an ongoing webinar series and educational events and networking events. But it was through that organization that I started representing churches and writing articles about religious freedom and presenting at conferences and representing clients. And then eventually I got the honor of representing the Church of the Eagle and Condor in their case to get recognition from the federal government for an ayahuasca-based religious practice. And we did take that case 3 years ago and worked our way through the courts and the Department of Justice and DEA. And in March, the DEA, for the first time ever, settled with an ayahuasca church. Instead of making us go to trial, they gave us formal recognition as the third ever ayahuasca church recognized in the United States after Santo Daime and UDV. So we got a little celebration for that. It really is amazing and exciting. That's part of what we're here to talk about today, is that what doors does this new recognition open for psychedelic churches, and what is the standard around that? But I just want to say I have another case going on right now in California for another ayahuasca church. It's Santo Daime inspired, but also hybridized practice, so it incorporates Umbanda, African animism, and other spiritual traditions. And we are pretty well into the lawsuit right now and expecting to have a positive outcome with that case, but it's really showing some of the new challenges that I'm going to talk about here today. So that's who I am. I'm a guy who's worked on the policy, who's worked on the religious freedom side. I work with ketamine clinics and doctors and therapists doing psychedelic therapy. General counsel for the Zendo Project, who's here on Playa, and we're very committed to harm reduction. My wife's on the board of Dance Safe. I'm also one of MAP's lawyers for their psychedelic science events. And so, I'm very fortunate to be in the position I am. And so I kind of see all the areas here, the FDA approval process, the state regulated psychedelics, the spiritual path. And I think my main message today is that I'm most excited about the spiritual path with psychedelics compared to all those other things we're talking about. Yes, we just saw what happened with FDA. They denied approval of MDMA as a treatment for PTSD, at least delayed, maybe not denied is the right word, but you can expect at least a 2 to 4 year delay on MDMA being approved as a therapy for PTSD based on what happened this summer. And that's a rollback, And so we have this FDA stuff that's happening, but I think you're going to see a lot of institutional resistance to that, and it's highly medicalized. And the problem with medicalization is most of us are Western people, and we think if I have a problem, I go to a doctor. So we don't really have this long history we were just talking about that. In indigenous cultures, it's not counterculture to use psychedelics, it's culture. If you're at an initiation point in your life or an important transition in your life, you go see the shaman and you have medicine, and it helps you become who you are, understand who you are, understand your relationship to the world. But in the West, we're becoming familiar with this area more and more, and many sincere practitioners are working there. But we really are wedded to this medicalization idea. And the problem with that is medicalization is going to come with a rule book and a clinical setting and eye shades and a playlist. And many of these therapists who are so deeply committed and good people, but they're not shamans, okay? You know, like I had a Lakota man tell me that you can write an instruction book for psychedelic therapy, but you can't teach people what it is to work with the medicine, with somebody in the medicine, unless you come from a culture and a tradition that has worked with this and knows how to do it for thousands of years. And so I think our challenge in the U.S. and the West is we're so attracted to the medicalization, but we're seeing the abuses in that system. We're seeing the failures with the MAPS FDA trials, with ethical breaches. I'm seeing it in my practice every day where, this therapy model and medicalization has something to teach to the spiritual world about boundaries and ethics, and I think there are things to learn there, but they're really not trained people to work with deep spiritual problems, and they're not really inclined to understand or work with the celestial beings and the interdimensional beings and the spirits and the world of the dead, and all the things we encounter in deep psychedelic work are pretty foreign to the medical model. So for those of us who've done a lot of work in the spiritual realm, there's something hollow about the medicalization, and I think it's going to be a long, arduous road, also an expensive road. The treatments in Oregon are $2,000 or $3,000 for one session with psilocybin, and it just feels to me that path is important. There are certain people that will only go there, and we need to work on that, and I'm giving my energy to that. But more importantly is the spiritual work, is the reconnecting with our own spirits, coming into relationship with the sacred is something that, Wendy and I now, we hold space for other people in ceremonies. I'm certainly not an expert here. 50 ayahuasca journeys, 10 5-MeO DMT ceremonies, obviously several psilocybin ceremonies. But what we see most often is that the West is so uncomfortable with deep sacred, with deep spiritual, because we really don't know how to be quiet and to receive. We're so eager to share and give. So it just seems like we have a long way to go in this spiritual work. But that's why I'm most excited about this, is because the transformational potential of spiritual work is, to me, and the way in which it can be access can be broad spread, because not everybody's going to be able to afford $3,000 regulated ceremonies, but maybe a $300 5-MeO. I mean, again, it's not cheap in the spiritual world. So I just think there's a lot of reasons why, access-wise, and then just in terms of long-term fundamental change. So many people are just looking for the magic pill with psychedelics to heal them. And what the spiritual work teaches you is that this is a lifetime experience, that there's not one event, that it's a way of life. And, reacquainting ourselves with the indigenous perspective on spirituality. This is one thing. I'm going to start talking about the law. The law doesn't really understand indigenous spirituality. So everybody says to me, well, the First Amendment is, I can do psychedelics because of the freedom of religion. And unfortunately in the U.S., the courts have interpreted the Constitution to mean that even if you have a spiritual practice that requires you to use psychedelics, that you're not exempt from criminal law just under the Constitution. And that was a ruling in the early 90s. And because of that, Congress stepped in and passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So this is really your primary defense in the United States, is RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It's not the First Amendment. We could talk about state laws. They're all different at every state level, but at least at the federal level, your protection is based on this federal law. And this law says that if you're engaged in the sincere practice of religion, notice the word religion, not spirituality, that the government cannot interfere with your religious practice unless it's got a compelling interest to do so, and it's narrowly tailored to the least restrictive means to accomplish that compelling interest concern. Normally it's public health, it's safety. And so, this was a law that, of course, was written primarily by people who wanted to protect Christianity and Western religions, and that's why Hobby Lobby can deny, reproductive freedom to their employees because they say it's against their religion to give women birth control. So that was probably who the law was designed for, but guess what? It really benefits the spiritual and psychedelic spirituality work. And so the first group that took advantage of this was the UDV, the União de Vegetal, a Brazilian ayahuasca church that was interfered with in the early 2000s and went on a 7-year lawsuit journey that ended up in the Supreme Court. And there's a Supreme Court case called O Centro. O Centro is the UDV case that said that ayahuasca, there was no compelling government interest to limit ayahuasca at the time. The government, I think, is trying to build an argument there might be now. But that was 2009. The Supreme Court said, yes, an ayahuasca church should not have to be criminalized if it's a sincere religious practice. A second church a couple years later, the Santo Daime out of Oregon, the Church of the Holy Light of the Queen, with my friend Jack Silver, took a case that went all the way to trial and ultimately led to recognition for the Santo Daime Church in the United States. So these are the two first initial ayahuasca psychedelic churches, UDV and Santo Daime. And then again, we're here 15 years later, we get the third ever recognized church. So what's happened in the interim is that everybody saw those cases, and now you guys see in your communities, people are saying, oh, I'm protected, I'm a 508c1a church, I'm a private ministerial association, I'm a PMA, but if you really dig underneath that, you'll find that nobody except these three churches are actually recognized. So what are they talking about? They're just saying that they have this argument that their work is legal because somebody else got recognized. But the government would say that's not how it works. When we're in these litigation cases and we start the conversation and say, oh, this is another ayahuasca church, you're going to recognize us, right? They say, we need to see, every church is different. So they're going to look at you in an individual assessment. And the most famous example of a denial is the SoulQuest case. SoulQuest is I think, primarily ayahuasca organization out of Florida. And I'm going to get to the punchline. They were shut down recently, but the story was they petitioned the government and they said, hey, guess what? We're an ayahuasca church. You got to recognize us like you did everybody else. The government they go out and do an investigation. They talk to your participants. What is this practice about? And people are like, oh, we're healing trauma, and all these beautiful statements that we commonly use in psychedelic church work. But then SoulQuest on paper was saying, well, we believe in the ayahuasca manifesto. And none of the people they talked to said anything about the ayahuasca manifesto. Also, there was this pay-to-play kind of perspective that all you had to do to go to SoulQuest was pay the money. There wasn't really any initiation or training or teaching of the doctrine. And based on that, the government said, we don't think this is a sincere practice, and they denied this petition. Meanwhile, the church had somebody die in a combo experience. Somebody was allowed to lock themselves in the bathroom for 45 minutes and drink water until they overdosed on water and died. So here's another example of poor facilitation and danger of emerging spiritual practices that, are they really protective? Are people in a safe place? And this death led to a $15 million judgment against the SoulQuest Church, which I found out recently. I guess it was doing pretty well. It was bringing in a couple $1 million a year in revenue, but they didn't have $15 million on hand. They tried to declare bankruptcy in federal court. Again, unless you had formal federal recognition, they won't let you declare bankruptcy for a cannabis business or a psychedelics business. So SoulQuest basically said, okay, we can't declare bankruptcy, we're out of business, and they shut down. So, there's a lot of criticism of that group, but they're sort of emblematic of what happens is we go sit with a shaman in South America or in the US, we get inspired, this is the greatest thing ever, and people are calling me saying, I just drank ayahuasca 3 times, I want to serve it in the United States, And obviously that's a very extreme example, but there's a lot of communities out there that are built on relatively recent initiates. And I don't want to call anybody out in particular, but I hear a lot of stories about people starting retreat centers or spiritual groups, and when you really ask the question, when did they start doing medicine work, a lot of them, it's pretty recent. 3 years ago, I did mushrooms for the first time, and now I'm a shaman. It's like, oh my God, right? So there's this problem with a lot of people. We get the ego inflation of psychedelic experiences. All of us have inherent healing powers, and we have the ability to heal each other, to heal ourselves. But I think it's this rush to, we're in such a time of extremes with extreme challenges at every level, our politics, our climate, the wars around the world, pandemics, and this is what indigenous people talk to us, and they say you need to slow down. We're all in such a rush to now I'm an ayahuasquero, now I can serve 5-MeO DMT. And I guess I just want to acknowledge a tension there, that I agree that there's a legitimate criticism of those who are rushing in to become spiritual practitioners, but at the same time, there's also kind of a desperation of we need to get this going because we need a broader spiritual awakening and really a change in the way we're living. And so I'm sympathetic to both sides of that argument. I don't have a great answer, but I would just say that is one of the things that I see a lot, is people are probably a little ahead of themselves with forming an ayahuasca church, a mushroom church. And I would encourage people to really ask yourself, do I have a teacher? Have I really based myself in a lineage or a tradition if you're going to be doing some of this work? And again, I know some people that say, well, look, mushrooms, I don't need a shaman, it's all self-taught, the medicine is teaching me. But I think we need to all consider the legitimacy of the work we're doing and look for, this is what I said about the regulated world teaching us lessons, look for that ego inflation, look for that counter-transference. If you're, I have a church that one of the main person says, well, I heal myself by healing others. That's how I'm healing myself. And I'm thinking, I think the way it's supposed to work is that you're in a grounded spiritual place, and then you're sharing that spirituality with others, not that you're looking for others to heal you through the work you're doing for them. So I think that's a whole issue. And I would say that it's also super complicated when you step into this work and say, I'm an ayahuasquero, I'm a medicine person. Again, a little bit of arrogance here from Western people who don't have a cultural background in this. And we saw it in the Church of the Eagle and Condor case, to just touch on this controversy, that Joe Tafur is an American doctor, Colombian American, who trained 7 years with Shipibo people in the jungle, has a teacher, Ricardo Amaringo, a very respected shaman who was chosen as a child as a shaman, has had ayahuasca since he was 6 years old, and is a true master. I've sat with him for 2 weeks, 12 ceremonies in Peru. This is, the Shipibo tradition is so beautiful and so powerful, and the spiritual technology is so old, 6,000 years. Shipibo talk about receiving the medicine and the wisdom from the Incas. So anyway, so he has this teacher, and the teacher trains him to serve to others and gives him permission to serve. And then we go through this whole case in the US, and we celebrate this victory and say, this is the first indigenous-inspired religious organization recognized in the United States. Because remember, those other two are Christian-based. UDV and Santo Daime have a Christianity overlay to them. Eagle and Condor was the first ever indigenous Shipibo-inspired, but Joe's not a Shipibo person. He's got Navajo people involved in his project, and some Shipibo people stepped up and said, this is not legitimate after he got recognized. And there was a group that reached out, or that put out a press release that said the government should revoke Eagle and Condor's recognition because this has not been approved by Shipibo people. So I was talking about getting a teacher and having a lineage, and then the question becomes, well, who in those cultures could give you permission to actually serve? Because one guy gives you permission, is that enough? Who's in charge of the Shipibo people? It's a very loose cultural affiliation. There's not like a government for the Shipibo people. So, and I could talk a lot about that. It turned out it was one Shipibo guy who was married to a Canadian woman, and there was some belief that they were just trying to get attention for a nonprofit they were working with. And I don't want to cast aspersions, but I just would say that that shows the complication of claiming lineage and claiming the right to serve, and just being very humble about that. I think after that controversy happened, Joe Tafur started taking out the Shipibo-inspired language on his website and not really emphasizing that because he's not a Shipibo person. So there's issues around legitimacy when you're doing this work. Okay, I wanted to talk about, we've talked about ayahuasca churches have been recognized. Well, what about mushroom churches? And you see those out there, and people that say 5-MeO is my spiritual practice, and MDMA. One of my personal goals, we really would like to broaden the field, so we have ayahuasca recognized. I think mushrooms would be the next easiest church to be recognized. When we get into the synthetics, MDA, MDMA, LSD, it's going to be more complicated. And then when we get into multi-sacramental churches, what about the churches that are saying, we do mushrooms on Friday, wachuma on Saturday, and ayahuasca on Sunday? I mean, it seems like it's becoming kind of a Burning Man event. Some of these churches are so aggressive with their poly-narcotic approach, right? So what does the government think about that? Well, remember, the standard is, does the government have a compelling interest to interfere with your practice? So in ayahuasca's case, like, obviously people aren't, I hope nobody's doing ayahuasca here at Burning Man. It seems like a really bad idea. I don't really know of recreational ayahuasca practices. It doesn't seem like a thing. So I think it was hard for the government to say this is a problem because it's really a spiritual thing. It's hard to argue it's not. But with mushrooms and MDMA, I mean, there's a very broad recreational practice around these substances. And the government could say, well, yeah, you might be a mushroom church, but we've got, I think I saw the statistics, 10% of Americans claim to have used psychedelics in a lifetime, and 2 or 3% are using them on a regular basis. I just saw a presentation from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Agency at the federal level, and I think they said there's like 8 million psychedelic users a year. So, okay, so great, your group of 20 or 30 people using mushrooms is fine, but what about the fact that this is a broad spread, recreational thing that people are eating and going to fish shows and doing it? So maybe there's a reason with this broad spread use, we can restrict you because we need to restrict recreational use, and you might allow people to take home microdoses and they might go do this for fun. And so there's going to be a different equation for mushrooms. There's going to be a different equation for MDMA. Mushrooms have a very low addiction rate. MDMA has some addiction problems with regular use. I know people that have had addiction issues with MDMA. So there's one where they could say, well, fine, you say this is your spiritual practice, but it also has this public health addictive problem, and we're not going to recognize MDMA. So this is up in the air whether these other substances could really be recognized. That's why all these people out there saying, I'm a mushroom church, I'm an MDMA, like, that is just hopeful thinking. It's, and maybe they're right, and maybe they have a really good argument. But then it also gets more complicated when we mix these medicines. So the law talks in terms of, we want to make sure you're not just calling this a spiritual practice as an excuse to use drugs. So the more they see, multi-sacramental, and you can imagine all the people who got arrested over the years who said, oh, no, this is religious. I'm using this as a religious thing. And welcome to my special friend here. Great to have you. Is it Elizabeth?
Kismet.
Kismet.
Or Kate.
Kate, that's right,
Yeah.
Kismet. Kate's a very special person. I was telling my new friend here about an experience I had. Kate's been really generous to connect people over time and provide opportunities for spiritual work. So thank you for being here. And just what I was saying about this, looking at it, you can imagine all the people that have said, oh no, I'm a spiritual practitioner. I have marijuana and mushrooms and everything under the sun. They came into Clayville and Nueva's house and he had, all the things. And then, Scientology. So there's been a whole diverse case law developed around what is a church. And some of the cases say, like, if it looks like it's just a money-making thing, then you're just covering up, you're just trying to make money. All the people that are selling mushrooms nationwide, drop ship over Instagram and, Venmo and all that, they might say there's some spiritual element. There's churches you can go online and just sign up and they'll send you sacrament that day. I think the government would look at that with severe skepticism, And so making money is one issue. Multiple substances is another. Having some consistent explanation. Like, I think you could do a multi-sacramental church, but you really need to show why each substance is so important. It's not, a lot of us do say, like, everything is sacred and all plant medicine is sacred and therefore any of these things is sacred, but there's some case laws that say that government cannot burden essential parts of your religious practice. If it's not an essential part, then they can burden it. So this would mean that when, they talked to this marijuana church and they said, well, what's your doctrine? And the church said, well, our doctrine is, marijuana helps us be good people. That's why we use it. Okay, well, they said, the judge was like, can you be a good person without using marijuana? Oh yeah, you don't have to use marijuana to be a good person. And they were like, aha, then that means that marijuana is not the essential part of your practice, and therefore we can impose Controlled Substances Act law on you. So that just shows that, the description of what you're doing. Again, now we're showing the anti-indigenous bias because they want us to write down what we believe. They want us to have a doctrine. They want us to have a hierarchy. I mean, I'll never forget, there was this question. We had DEA come out to my ayahuasqueros house, and we're showing them the ayahuasca. It goes in the fridge, and and then they're like, well, what happens if somebody violates your doctrine? Like, do they go to hell? And everybody just kind of looked around. They're like, no, we just love them more? Like, I don't know. No, there's not really a punishment. But this is the way the law is thinking about it. They're thinking about Christianity and Judaism and Islam and major religions, and that's why I said this thing's a little bit of a round peg in a square hole, because honestly, spirituality is broader than religion. Religion's a subset of spirituality. Religion is doctrinal, but this is not the way indigenous people work. If you went to a Shipibo person and said, what's your doctrine? They would just be like, what are you talking about? Like, we're in relationship to the celestial realm, the underworld, to Pachamama, and the living realm, and medicines are about a relationship between these realms. And the meaning isn't set out in advance. So the whole idea that you could sit down and say, the meaning of life is X, Y, Z, it's like, no, that's not. This is a Western way of looking at spirituality. And so part of the work is changing the law and educating the judges that there is another way that the meaning is revelatory in the moment, it's individual for each person, it's in context of their community and their culture, but it's not like I could sit down and write down, Kismet's meaning of life in advance. It's like she's going to discover that in the work. But this is an example of the challenge we face. Like, my clients, what I like to see is what you really want is if somebody walks in the door, you're not all going to jail. So how do you do that? Ideally, you show them something they're familiar with, a state-incorporated religious nonprofit. We can all go to our state secretaries of state and for $50 or $60 incorporate a religious organization. You don't have to do that. People are like, I don't need to get government recognition to be a church. That's true. But if somebody walks in the door, I want to say, what are you talking about? We're a state-incorporated religious nonprofit. We have doctrine. We teach people about, the importance of this medicine and what it does for us. And It's not just pay to play. They have to learn something. So this problem I mentioned earlier, if you're doing this work, I want to see that we go talk to the participants and they say, oh yeah, the Church of the Eagle and Condor is about the unity of all mankind, and it's about connecting with the divine through a sacrament, ayahuasca. I mean, these are like the basic doctrine of this church. And that's going to protect you. Because if you just say, well, I'm spiritual, that's enough, like I talk to these people every day. The DAs and the cops are like, what are you talking about, 508c1a? And many people have been forced into plea bargains, and they've gotten prosecuted, and they've taken deals, and they promise not to do the medicine for a period of time, and they're going to take drug tests and go to drug education, and it's crazy. If you want to avoid that, then my advice is you need to be closer to this maximum defense that you can get some kind of a state incorporation, some kind of doctrine, some kind of protocol for who serves the medicine, how long do they need to train, a process for people becoming medicine carriers, a diversion prevention plan. These are the things the government is asking me for in these cases. Like, how are you going to avoid somebody stealing your eye? Nobody would do this, but and so unfortunately it means things like security plans and look, I have some clients that are like, we are not putting sacrament in a safe. And I respect that. If your bottom line doesn't fit some of these court standards, then we can explain that to the government. But what I like to see, because there's only two ways to get recognition from the government. One, you go petition the DEA and you say, I'm a psychedelic church. They've had 15 petitions in 15 years and they've never approved one of them. Usually what they do is they do nothing for 2 or 3 years, and they ask you to stop doing sacrament while they're considering your application. So you're supposed to stop using your sacrament. They blow you off for years. And then in the Soul Quest example, they nitpicked them to death and found a reason to say no. So that seems like a dead end right now, petitioning the DEA. The only other way is that you literally have some interference. The government seizes your ayahuasca at the border, they raid you, they take your medicine. If you get interfered with, you could say, okay, judge, please tell the government to stop messing with me. But that's not a very inviting path either, because that means you have to be interfered with. And so those are the only two ways to get formal recognition. And because that's so hard, everybody else is just living in this, I've got a good argument world. So that's what I'm talking about, building your argument as strong as you can, trying to address some of those factors that the courts have talked about over the years. And the good news is a lot of us have those factors, right? Like the factors are, what is the meaning of this work? And we could all rattle off 6 or 7 basic plant medicine principles. We're connecting to the divine within, connecting to the divine in each other, connecting to Mother Earth, healing trauma, opening ourselves to the wisdom of plants, to the wisdom of ancestors. And I think you could get those things down. And then there's things like, what are your holidays? Well, those are easy too. Like most people in plant medicine communities respect the equinox and the solstice and the full moons, and some of my churches celebrate Earth Day. And so we have some of these things the government wants. We have, a doctrine. We have something, what this means to us. We have holidays. We have dietary restrictions before ceremony, restrictions on lifestyle, like don't have sex 3 days before ceremony. And we can meet a lot of these things. We wear white to ceremony, so clothing descriptions. So I think if you want to have a defense that's in the top of this most defensible world, so that you not only you want to avoid being prosecuted at all is the first goal, and second, if God forbid they just are ignorant and prosecute you, then you'll have the kind of case they'll dismiss. So I represented the church, the Sacred Tribe, Jewish psychedelic church in Denver. A couple of years ago, before we decriminalized stuff, police walked into a warehouse. This is all public information, a big Denver Post article about it. There was hundreds of pounds of mushrooms, allegedly. Of course, they weigh everything, the substrate and everything else. But initially, 2 people were charged with very serious felonies. Like, people always say, what's the worst that could happen? Well, Colorado and most states, if you're distributing enough mushrooms, we're talking about 8-year mandatory prison sentences and, you know, mandatory minimums and big bad mean stuff, right? Well, after the DA got involved, they didn't have formal recognition, but we did show that it was all donation-based, that they weren't selling medicine, nobody was getting like, you know, $50 a month for a supply, it was just ceremonies, and that they had a very serious spiritual practice, and they had a couple hundred people doing the work, and that's why they had so many mushrooms, and they dismissed the case at the end of the day. So the better that defense is, the more likely you're going to have a total dismissal, or worst case scenario, at least you're not going to end up with a permanent felony conviction or some kind of probation. But it's these people on the other end of the spectrum that, you know, most people call me and they say, I got arrested or raided and I need to figure out how I'm going to explain what I'm doing. And they incorporate a church the day after the raid, and the government sees that. They're like, well, obviously this didn't exist before you got arrested. And, you know, even the people selling mushrooms all over the country, some of them, these websites, they make you sign something saying you believe in their doctrine. I just think it's a very weak defense. It's the kind of thing that maybe you get a little better a deal, sweetheart deal, but you're going to have to take a deal. If you really want recognition or avoidance of any kind of criminal liability, you're going to have to do all those things I said and try to address some of the factors that the law says are important. And when you think about this, you know, honestly, maybe a lot of our work isn't religion. You know, a lot of people are uncomfortable with that topic. I've got trauma. I'm a recovering Catholic, you know, so there's a lot of trauma around the term religion, and people are resistant to, well, I don't really want to become a prophet or like have any kind of cult-like feel to what I'm doing. That's going to turn people off. And I totally get that. Well, I guess where that leads me is that the spiritual work is not easy. You really have to do all those things I said. You really are going to have to justify yourself to the government. It sort of maybe calls into question, maybe a lot of you should be working in the decriminalized environment. Because in Colorado, for example, we don't have to have a spiritual reason to sit in a circle and eat mushrooms. Every adult in the state of Colorado can share mushrooms, mescaline, and DMT, and that's legal. So why would you go through all that hassle and brain damage if there's and I'm not saying it's not a spiritual work, but like for those of you that are resistant to this formalization and making something super defined, my great friend Bob Otis Stanley with the Sacred Garden community in Oakland, and they have committees and doctrine and ethics council, and it's a huge organization. They got 250 people on a regular basis working with them. Maybe that's not what you really want to do. So then it calls into question, maybe you really just should work in the decriminalized environment if you want less risk. So yeah, I guess just that's like a quick overview of the legal realm. And I think the question is there space for mushroom churches and DMT churches and multi-sacramental churches? But as we do reform around the country, I do want to encourage people to really start with decriminalization, because that really will allow us to build an organic spiritual practice around psychedelics without this complex dogma, definition like we're talking about in the religious world. And this is where I think we're in a time of contraction right now with psychedelic reform, FDA denying MDMA, a lot of skepticism about some of this religious work in this new case, the Church of the Celestial Heart. They're asking hard questions. They're saying things like, well, aren't you just selling medicine? $300 a ceremony, you're just selling DMT. And so, I don't know, I just think as you do this reform, you might also want to really lead with decriminalization, because in a lot of places that's in contraction too. In California, we had this law that would have decriminalized psychedelics and created a regulated pathway for some of them. And Newsom vetoed the decriminalization part because he was nervous about broad spread decriminalization. And in a lot of these other states, the laws you see that are coming on the books are research bills, like, a hospital can do work with psychedelics, but if we lose decriminalization, we're going to lose this whole exploratory part of the movement where we can develop these practices, where we can take our time, where we can learn what it is to us. And maybe it's not a full-blown spiritual religious practice. Maybe it's a life enhancement practice that you're doing. And so I just encourage people that are really in that bucket to don't try to shoehorn it into a religion just to get a defense. Like, you really need to be practicing something like a religious or spiritual practice to get government respect and recognition. I think they didn't have any problem with the Church of the Eagle and Condor because it's a 40-person church in Arizona, very small. It's super sincere. It's voluntary donations, not mandatory. But as we get into these churches that it's monthly donation mandatory and nationwide, I think you're going to face a lot of scrutiny. But I am, as I said at the beginning, I'm so positive about this area because I feel like this might be the thing we're all looking for, is some reconnection with the spiritual world. And I think what you learn, the more medicine you do, at least my journey has been like, I'm past this point of, I don't need medicine every month. I'm not on a quest to tick off a spiritual bucket list. And you might need less or no medicine over time. Or certainly it doesn't have to be all the time. And so yeah, I deal with a lot of people that are in this field, and I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say here about the decrim. So we do have Massachusetts has a ballot initiative in November that would create a regulated pathway to psilocybin and decriminalize it as well. So I'm glad Massachusetts is sticking with the decrim aspects of this, and I encourage that for every community. I think we only have a couple minutes left. I've talked here, so I do want to give you guys a chance. But yeah, my overall take is that the thing we're looking for might be found in a spiritual practice, not in a doctor's office or not in a recreational experience. And that's where my hope for psychedelics lies, is that we all become awakened and commit ourselves to something beyond ourselves. And I've seen it work in my life and help heal my family. And so I just know you are all similar-minded people, and happy to answer any questions in the last 5 minutes we have.
I'm really glad to hear that you mentioned that, as you get older, you come to a point in your life you don't need this stuff anymore. You find out who you are and you just kind of live. I quit everything like 15 years ago, right? I'm sure I was a functioning alcoholic working in Russia and all over the world, right? But there comes to a point where you just say, okay, enough's enough. I don't need this anymore. I'm happy with who I am. I'm not searching. I found myself, however you want to deal with it. But I think that's a good thing to push. So I'm really glad you said that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we talk. Oh yeah, he was affirming that this comment about there comes a time when you might not use as much medicine has been an important lesson for him as well. But think about that, how that impacts. If you said that to the government, like, yeah, it's an essential thing of our religious practice, but there's going to come a time when maybe you don't need it at all. They might be like, oh, okay, then it's not essential, is it? Yeah. And this is why I say we need a spiritual restoration act, not a religious freedom restoration act, because we have a very small perspective on what religion is right now. And we can win these arguments. And the goal is to broaden the field right now, but eventually maybe we need, an Indigenous Spiritual Restoration Act, Earth-Based Religion Spiritual Restoration Act, that we wouldn't have to have a doctrine in advance. So yeah. Sir.
Two questions, okay. First one, semantics. Does it have to be called a church, or could it be a temple, or?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be called a church. It's the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So they're looking for indicia of religious practice, and it can be called anything: temple, sanctuary. Most of my places are sanctuary of this, sanctuary of that. And the IRS says that you don't have to have IRS recognition to be a church. You just have to practice consistent with the 501c3 rules. So this is where I was talking about a state incorporation without IRS. If you go to IRS and say, I'm a mushroom church, they're going to deny you. They will not give you recognition. Now, some people have gotten it because they go to IRS and they just say, we're a religious organization, give us recognition. They don't talk about the plant medicine. So you might be able to kind of game that system a little bit, but you don't need IRS recognition, but you do need to practice consistent with these rules. And the rules are about nonprofits are not for personal adornment or benefit. Yes, so nonprofits can take in money and pay people to work for them, but it's not like every dollar that comes into a church goes to the pastor. That means the church is for one person's benefit or a handful of people. So this is why it's also hard, because if you set up a religious organization, I want to see you're bringing in the money, you're paying people market-based, reasonable payment for their services. And if there's money left over, it doesn't go to buy you a house or take a vacation. It goes to educate people about the religious organization and propagate the mission. And so it doesn't have to be called a church, but it does have to be run like one, where you could be vulnerable on the IRS side.
Second question. It's my understanding that it is helpful to have some sort of reoccurring meeting every week with the members. How does an online presence work? Let's say you don't have a location.
Yeah. So the question was, it's helpful to have he's understanding it's helpful to have a weekly meeting. What about an online presence? How does that look? Yeah, I mean, look, I want to not denigrate people that are doing these things, because in an ideal world, nobody would be criminalized for working with plant medicines or even selling them. Like, I don't have any ethical or moral problems with somebody selling mushrooms. Like, it doesn't really offend me. But the more it looks like that, the lower you're going to be in that defense. So, yes, if you had an online presence with a weekly event, with integration meetings and calls and WhatsApp groups for integration and access to services for people that are struggling, all these things are going to make it look better. If it's just you sign up on the website, you pay a fee, and I send you medicine, then I think you're more vulnerable. And people, there's the problem you all have is that it's like, well, everybody else is getting away with it. Why would I do something more formal? And it's true. Like, the environment is very tolerant around this stuff. There's not a lot of examples of people getting in trouble for this, and I get calls every month from people selling hundreds of thousands of dollars of mushrooms online every month. And then, they're like, well, everybody else is doing it. But I do have examples of like 6 people prosecuted in Ohio for sending mushrooms across the country, millions of dollars, and they all got prosecuted federally, and $1.5 million in assets were seized. And so maybe the chances are small, but the consequences are big. And so if you're a cautious person, you're going to do everything you can. If anybody ever walked in the door, you're not going to be that person. So yes, weekly meetings and teaching people the doctrine and having ceremonies, I think those are critical elements.
Sorry to personalize it, but just curious about this. You raised a comment on how you could say psychedelics have helped you because you got personally thought. Say you were in a court case and you said that, would they turn around and say, would there be another avenue that you could have gone down to help you over that trauma? Is that something that the establishment would use as part of their defense?
Yeah, so the question was, what if you say you've benefited from psychedelics? Will the government challenge you and say, were there other avenues you could have done this? Is this, you're triggering, there's a doctrine called choice of evils defense that, well, I had to do this because I was really struggling, and then part of the choice of evils defense is the standard you're talking about that, well, did you try everything else before you did that? Anyway, it's kind of an interesting question, but it triggers for me that all of us individually have religious freedom arguments about our psychedelic use separate from any religious organization. So if I was a member of the Church of the Eagle and Condor, I clearly would have a doctrinal connection and defense. But what if I'm just drinking ayahuasca or eating mushrooms on my own? You do have an individual spiritual defense that this is your personal spiritual practice. And this was upheld in the Massachusetts or New Hampshire courts, where a guy raised the spiritual defense to mushroom possession. Initially was convicted, they denied him having that right to have that defense, goes up to appeal, and the appeals court said, yes, you individually can say, I had these mushrooms because I was engaged in a spiritual practice without any connection to any organization. So then the question would be, yeah, how do you show, many of us have blended practices. I'm probably going to have some psychedelics this weekend and not in a spiritual context. So if I'm doing them at Burning Man, but also having ceremonies where we're praying and calling in ancestors, does that show I'm not sincere? It's going to be a case-by-case test, and the more it looks like you're ritually using psychedelics for a spiritual purpose, the better you'll be. Okay, I think we have to wrap up, but yeah, just thank you guys for coming. I was kind of worried no one would be here, so it's an honor for you to spend some time with me. Sean McAllister, McAllister Law Office, Denver, Colorado. Just search psychedelic law attorney. I will give anybody a free initial talk if you want to talk about this. There's back to Chacruna. Chacruna has an amazing church guide for psychedelic churches. I can send it to you. You can search for it. There's a lot of resources out there that you want to educate yourself. Think about this. There's the Sacred Plant Alliance, which was incubated by Chacruna, which is a coalition of plant medicine churches developing best practices for these organizations. So reach out to me or look online. There's a lot of sources, and just proceed with caution, and many blessings in all your journeys. May you all continue your healing path and be lovely, beautiful people and help us save the world. Lots of love.
Thank you.